Hi, this is Mr. Pasquale, and if you're watching this, these are our notes on the history of the Middle East. Now, this has been broken up into three parts: Ancient Middle East, 20th century, and Modern Middle East. I want to start by looking at the ancient history. Really hard to understand the Middle East if you don't look at what happened centuries ago. Um, there's various different kingdoms. Some of them you probably heard of when you were in seventh grade. There was the ancient kingdom of Israel. A lot of you might recall that from the Bible with the Hebrews. Uh, some of you that know the Bible really well might know that they were exiled a few times, once to Babylon over here, another time to Egypt, which we'll talk about later. But you had various kingdoms throughout the Middle East. You had the kingdom of Israel, the Babylonian Empire, which I know you guys studied, which extended into Iran, into Africa, over into Turkey, and later you had the Persian Empire, or excuse me, before the Babylonians, you had the Persians, and you had their empire extending all the way up to Europe. If you've seen the movie 300, you might know a little bit about that. But these massive empires existed in different times. Sometimes they overlapped each other, but it really helped form the foundation of a lot of the culture and religion that is in the Middle East today, especially when you're talking about Israel and the idea of monotheism showing up in a lot of these cultures. So, had a big impact on what would eventually become the Middle East as we know it today. Now, where we really want to get going and talk about is the rise of Islam. We're going to spend a good deal of this unit talking about Islam, and can't talk about Islam without talking about Muhammad, the founder of Islam. Islam really spreads to the rest of the world beginning in about the 600s. It starts down here in southwestern Saudi Arabia and then expands over time to include areas of the Fertile Crescent, the Nile Valley, rest of the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, into North Africa, and eventually all the way up into Europe. The Islamic Empire was huge, it was massive. Um, Muhammad was able to do this because of his message. It was a divine message from God. He was able to unite the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, and he became the first caliph or caliph. I've heard it pronounced both ways. A leader of the Islamic community, and he has still helped establish the first caliphate, the Islamic Empire, in the Middle East. Here you can see areas of expansion under Muhammad, and then the first four caliphs. I call them caliphs. Um, Also known as the rightly guided caliphs, and then the Umayyad caliphs expanding later. Now, he was able to expand so quickly because of one of the reasons was the decline of the West. This was a post-Roman world. The Roman Empire was in disarray. It had collapsed, and it was not the strength that it once was. Now, you did have the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, but again, they were fractured. You had numerous parts of the Byzantine Empire that didn't get along with each other. It was basically, you had the decline of the West, weaknesses of the West, and also divide and conquer. These states were against each other anyway. Islam was able to push into those areas. Muhammad, on the other hand, was able to unite the tribes of Islam under the banner of Allah, one worship of one God. And a lot of his message and a lot of the Quran had a rich history in that area. It grew out of the Jewish tradition. It had the same background as Christianity, same background as Judaism. This was just a continuation of that religion, that same one God. So they were able to unite a large group of people. The Muslims had common borders. We really didn't have borders, but they were in the same area. Common language and culture in Arabic. And their whole mission was divine conquest. They were doing God's work. When you're doing God's work, you're not dealing on your timetable. This could take centuries, and they were willing to do that. In the first eras of the Islamic Caliphate, you had a lot of advancement in science and technology, far outpacing the West. The Arabs were able to preserve a lot of the Greek learning and keep a lot of the books and texts and carry on with that. You had a lot of the first surgeries being done in the Muslim Empire, a lot of the first medicines being created, science and technology, the first telescope. A lot of advancements that the West wouldn't see for years happened first in the Middle East. You had the development of algebra, the first watch, and because you're dealing with people many of them were desert dwellers. You had to navigate by the stars. So navigation by the stars actually began with the Islamic Empire. So this knowledge would eventually be spread to the west of the world, but it started here. Now Islam expanded, as I already said. However, that expansion isn't going to last, and eventually there's going to be division. Once Muhammad died, you had successive caliphs that were considered rightly guided caliphs. They were, followed by everybody. But then, the question of succession really started to become big. You had the Battle of Karbala in the year 680. Imam Shia Ali, he was a leader of one of the Islamic factions, and he was pushing that only the descendants of Muhammad should be caliph. That was what Shiites, which they eventually would become known as Shiites, believed. They were a smaller group found mostly in Iraq and Iran, and you had the other group of Muslims known as Sunnis. They believed the caliph could be appointed. He didn't have to be related to Muhammad. This was the larger group. You find them mostly in the Arabian Peninsula and the Fertile Crescent areas. Now this situation still isn't settled today, but the big division happened at the Battle of Karbala in Iraq in 680, where Imam Shia Ali was killed. And after that, you had a schism in Islam, much like you see with Protestants and Catholics in Christianity. The same thing happened in Islam. And even today, Shiites still mourn the death of Shia Ali. That's what Ashura is all about. We've talked about that in Iran. After that, you had later dynasties and other various dynasties in Islam, and it starts to become more divided the further away from Muhammad you get. You have the Abbasid dynasty, Umayyad dynasty, Almoravids, Seljuks, Ottomans, various other dynasties. And as Islam grew, it did conquer other areas, but you had different forms of Islam, different types of caliphates. So things start to change as Islam gets bigger. Now you do have a big showdown in what we call the Middle Ages between Christian West in Europe and the Middle East, called the Crusades. The Crusades is, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating periods in history. You have Christianity going up against Islam. The Christian states in Europe feared Islamic expansion, and they wanted to recapture the Holy Land of Jerusalem. So the Pope, who was very powerful at this time, you got to remember, there was just one type of Christianity at this point in history. There wasn't Protestantism, there wasn't Calvinism. It was just everybody was a part of the Catholic Church, and the Pope was in charge of Christianity. The Pope said something, you did it. So the Pope asked the Christian kings to defend Christianity and send soldiers to the Holy Land in order to recapture Jerusalem. They did this. They invaded Turkey. They went through there, went through the Mediterranean, and eventually did capture Jerusalem. And in doing so, slaughtered the entire population, whether they were Jews, Christians, or Muslims, everybody. It was a very horrific attack, a very horrific siege, and Muslims still talk about it today. Now, that wasn't the end of the story. There would be numerous crusades. Jerusalem would go back and forth throughout history, and really wouldn't be finally settled until the Battle of Hattin, when you may have heard of Saladin led an Islamic army and they captured Jerusalem, and that was the last time Jerusalem would change hands. From then on, most of the Middle East and on up into Turkey maintained or was in control of Islamic empires. Most notably, the Ottoman Empire existed in Turkey, and from really about the 13th to the 19th or the 20th century, it was the center of Islam. It started out being more religious, and then towards the end ended up more nationalistic, a little more secular. But for years, it controlled the two holiest places in Islam, that of Mecca and Medina. Arabs, for their part, throughout time, started to resent this. They started to view the Ottomans as foreigners, especially as they adopted more modern and Western ways of behaving and dressing. Turkish, after all, was a different language than Arabic. You had a lot of Ottoman Turks were being perceived by the Arabs as more European than being Arab, and there was a lot of resentment there. And the British were able to successfully use that resentment in the early 20th century during the First World War to help foment an Arab rebellion against the Ottoman Turks. And they were able to successfully do this, and the Arabs eventually were able to gain control of the two holiest places of Islam, Mecca and Medina. Now, there is some extra credit that I'm going to offer for this unit, but it needs to be done before the end of the 9 weeks. You are to view and write a critical review of one of the following films. Kingdom of Heaven, which I like a lot. Orlando Bloom's in it. It's about the Crusades. Historically accurate? Nah, a little bit. But it's a very interesting story, and if you want to learn more about this time period, it's definitely something that can help spark your interest. I really like it. It's a long movie. It's a little bit difficult to follow, a lot of characters, but nonetheless, still a very good movie. Another good one, my all-time favorite movie, Lawrence of Arabia, 1962. This is a classic film. It takes place during World War I and covers that Arab rebellion that I was talking about. You should know a little bit something about World War I first. You might want to look for it on the internet, or I can provide you with any materials you might like. Now, the last one, Destiny, I've never seen. This is about the Muslim conquest of Spain. It does seem to be highly recommended, but like I said, I've never seen it. So just, some food for thought there. That's where we're going to end. I'll pick up the second part on this when we start talking about the modern Middle East.